Okay, so we were looking at the process of creating a data set using custom report, right? And we looked at what are the prerequisites for a custom report to be used as a data source for your base data set. Okay, okay. So next, we'll talk about creating base data sets. Creating base data sets from custom report. Okay, so I would go back to the tenant and go to the data catalog. So I want to create a new base data set, and I want to do that using a custom report. So I'll go back to the data catalog view and I'll go ahead and create a base data set. Now there are three options for creating a base data set: from a custom report, from a file, or from a server, from an SFTP. So I'm selecting the option from custom report. Okay, the next thing, I'll have to select the relevant custom report. So here it will only show me those reports which are enabled for Prism Analytics. So basically those reports which follow these criteria are the ones which will be displayed. Okay, the first report I want to create is, or the first base data set that I want to create is for importing the company structure. So I'm selecting that as my data source. Now this report doesn't have any selection criteria. So similar to how we create EIBs, if there is any report criteria, then those criteria basically the default options with which the report has to be run. At this point in time, when I run this report, it simply gives me the output. There's no run criteria or selection criteria or prompt criteria that I have to define. And that's why none of that is displayed. Okay, the second one is the environment restrictions. Now, what are these environment restrictions? Okay, so whenever we create
Is it like security?
yes. Have you create any security proxy access policy?
No,
Okay, so what happens is now,
no.
sure. Okay, so the idea is when a data set integration runs in an environment. So for your custom report, when I go ahead and save this data set, it will go ahead and create an integration, right? Okay, now subsequently, now the first time when I create this base data set, it will import whatever data is there in my custom report. But later on, I go ahead and change my companies. Or let's say I talk about the other report, which is worker details. Now, new employees, new workers get hired, old workers get terminated. So my data is not static. After I have imported the data, I need to keep re-importing the data at regular intervals, right? So whenever I run this report, it will basically check the environment restrictions that have been defined here. So if I go to this list, it will show me all the tenant environments. So let's say I have selected the environment as production. Now when I run this integration or when I run this base data set to import any data, it will basically check the environment in which this base data set is being executed. And then it will match whether that environment is the same as the restricted to environment. Only if there is a match, the integration will run and get the data. If there is no match, which means if I'm running this integration or this base data set in, let's say, sandbox, whereas the environment restriction is production, then my data set will fail. Now, why is this important? This is simply an additional safety measure. So you don't want, let's say, once your integration has gone live, once your Prism has gone live, or your system has gone live, you don't want someone to, let's say, by mistake import production data into non-production systems, right? So what you'll do is you'll go ahead and define the environment restriction as production. Or let's say your system is still not live, right? You're still making changes, and you don't want someone to by mistake run this integration in production, or this this data set in production. So you don't want this data set to run in production environment, and that's why, let's say, you have selected the environment as implementation, sandbox, and testing. So however, whatever you set, for whatever reasons, whenever you run this data set to import data, your data set will compare in which tenant that data set is being executed and whether that tenant is listed here. If there is a match, then your data set will import data, else it will fail. Make sense?
So basically, we are avoiding this base data set to be run in these three tenants or in
We are
production, like
saying this
in.
tenant should only run in these, or this data set should only be restricted to run in these three tenants. Okay. So
Okay,
whatever
because we are just
prompts,
because this data set is in progress.
right. So we are
That's why.
saying this data set can only be executed in these three environments right now. So even if I by mistake import this data set into production, when I run it, it will fail because the environment restriction is not specified as production. Okay. So whatever environments you specify here, your data set can only run in those tenants. Make sense?
Uh,
Okay. So the first thing that you create, so for creating a data set, you select the custom report, right? Define the prompt values. Now for this report, there are no prompt values. That's why you didn't have to define them. Okay, the second thing, now this is important. In the environment restrictions section, select the environment in which you want to use the in which you want to run the data set to import data, right? So the idea is when a data set integration, or simply for now, you can say when a data set, right, runs in an environment, it will only succeed if the restricted to environment matches the current environment. So if you are running this data set in any environment or any tenant, it will only succeed if the restricted to tenant matches the tenant in which you are running this integration. Okay, so there should be match in the tenants that you have listed here and the tenant in which you are actually running that integration or that data set. Okay, if you leave everything blank, then basically you're saying it can be run in any of the tenants.
okay.
Okay,
So what is the
And
best practice to follow while
the
creating
best
any
practice is before it goes live, when it is still in sandbox and until you have the sign off, do not specify production,
Okay,
right? And
got it.
after it has gone live, in production, only specify production as the environment.
Okay, got
Okay.
it. But we can
Okay.
make the changes, right? Once this is
We can
created.
anytime. So later on as well, I
Okay.
can go ahead and change this data set. That is fine. Okay. The next one is, if you see, as I mentioned, the moment you create a data set using your custom report or using an SFTP, it creates an integration and you can define the integration run schedule. So this is similar to how we schedule a custom report. I can either run now or I can schedule it to run in the future. Now later as well, I can go ahead and change this integration schedule. So for now, and we'll talk about those integration run schedules later. For now, I'll go ahead and simply run it now, right? Or I can say, okay, it has to run on a daily basis or a weekly basis. So on a weekly basis, it will automatically trigger this custom report, which is the data source. This custom report will fetch data based on whatever latest data is available in Workday, and that data would be retrieved into this data set. So for now, I'm simply saying run now. And okay. Okay, now here I'll go ahead and give a name. Please remember that your data set cannot be renamed after saving. So
Oh,
always two things I mentioned. One is the tags and then is the meaningful names. So if you have to change your data set, then you'll have to delete it. If you have to change the name of the data set after you have saved it. So give a meaningful name to your data set because you'll not be able to change it later on. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it WB Feb 7th. This is my base data set. So I'm calling it BDS 01, right? I created it through a custom report. So I'm simply calling it CR. And then I am importing the company structure. I'll call it company structure or company details, right? So BDS identifies that
status.
this is a base data set.
Okay.
And then the naming convention for DDS is derived data set is DDS. And finally, when you publish your data set, you call it a PDS, right? Okay, so this is your base data set, and that's why I'm calling it BDS. I can give some description, right? So this data set imports company structure from Workday. Now you can run this integration. As I mentioned, your integration, once you go ahead and schedule that, here we only selected the option run now. But then we had the ability to run it on a recurring basis, a daily basis, a weekly basis, or even later on. Even though I have scheduled it to run just now, later on I can go ahead and rerun this data set to import whatever latest data is there. Now, whenever I'm running this data set to import new data, how would the new data get be imported? Will it be replaced? Will it be imported in replace mode or append mode? So what is replace mode? If you see replace, Workday deletes the existing data in the data set and replaces it with the data it imports from the custom report during each integration run. So every time you run the integration, if you have selected the mode as a replace, your all the existing data within the data set will be deleted and new data, whatever is being imported, will be added to your data set, right? So all the existing data in the data set is deleted, which means your data set becomes blank, and whatever new data is there in the custom report, that entire data gets added to your data set. So that is why it is called a replace mode. It is replacing all existing data with the new data.
Okay, so every time I'll get the most recent data. It will
Every time I'll
replace
get
the old
all the
data.
data which is there in the custom report.
Okay.
Okay. So when I run it for the first time, now this data gets imported, right? Next time when I rerun this integration, let's say there are only two companies. So it will delete all these companies which are already there in the data set and replace it with those two companies. Okay, so basically all of my existing data in the data set will be replaced. It will be deleted and new data added. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Again, so this is similar. Let's assume I have two companies earlier, company one and company two. So this is the data which gets imported to my base data set, BDS01. Now next time when I run this report or run this data set, let's say the company is company 2, company 3, and company 4. Now because I'm running it in replace mode, this entire data gets deleted, and whatever new data is there, it gets copied. So this will be the new data. Okay, all existing data gets deleted and new data gets pasted in its place. Okay, so this is how it will look. Company 1, company 2, sorry, company 2, company 3, and company 4. This happens in replace mode. Now the second one is append mode. So as the name suggests, in append, Workday keeps the existing data and adds to it the new data it imports from the custom report. Now if you see, already I have two pieces of records, company 1 and company 2. Now I'm running this in append mode. So I'm running it in append mode. So earlier I had company 1 and company 2. Sorry. Now when I'm rerunning it in append mode, the new data is company 2, company 3, company 4. So what will happen? The existing data remains as is. So it keeps all the existing data and adds to it the new data from the custom report. So what is the new data from the custom report? This 3. So this simply gets added. So in replace mode,
Okay.
this is how my data would look. In append mode, this is how my data would look. Okay, so my existing data remains as is. The new data gets appended. In replace mode, my existing data gets deleted. Only my new data is shown. So be very careful with append mode, because with append mode, system would not check if there are any duplicates. It will simply check what is the new data in your custom report. Simply take that data and add to the existing data, right? So whatever data
Got
your
it.
custom report is fetching, everything gets added. So if you see, Workday imports all data in the report during every integration run, resulting in duplicate data in the data set. Select append mode for custom report dataset when you want a snapshot of the custom report to maintain history in the dataset for trending use cases. So when will you use a append mode? Only when you want to maintain trending data. So you want to know what was the data in June versus what is the data in July versus what is the data, let's say, in August, and so on and so forth. So only when you want to maintain that history of how your data is changing over time, only then use an append mode. So similar to how we use the trending report. Else, do not use append mode. So by default, use replace mode only if you have a specific requirement wherein you need to maintain old history as well. Only then, sorry, always use replace mode only when you want to maintain old history for a very specific requirements. Only then select append mode. Okay. Else, select replace mode.
Yes, got it.
Okay. So okay. So data update modes, and we have replace and append. Okay, one more thing, as I mentioned, name of the data set cannot be changed once saved. So now I'll come in here, click OK. This has created my data set. Let's go to say done. So this is my data set. Now if you see with data set, I didn't have to create any schema. So what is a data set? As we discussed, a data set controls some underlying data and describes the processing logic for that data. So data set basically consists of the schema of the data, which is basically the metadata, and the transformation logic for that data. So unlike your tables, right, whenever you are dealing with any traditional database or any traditional table, you first define the table schema and then you import data into that table. Without table schema, you cannot import any data. Here, if you see, I didn't have to define any schema. I didn't have to define the columns of this data set. I simply imported data, and when I did that, Workday automatically created the schema for me. And here, these names, if you see, these are my XML override aliases. So that is why it is important that once you have created a data set, you do not change that XML alias. If you change that, then you'll have to again go ahead and rename your data sets as well. The second thing, now if I click here on this table view, you see all of my data which was there in my custom report is already imported into this data set. Okay, so what all does it include? Company name, company WID, sector, parent company, parent company WID. So company name, company WID, sector, parent company WID. Now, in addition to this, if you see, Workday has created two additional fields. One is WPA load ID and then WPA load timestamp. So in addition to all those fields, which were there in the custom report, Workday has automatically added these two fields. One is load ID and load timestamp. Now this is especially helpful in your append mode because you're continuously adding data and so what is WPA load ID? Every time you run or load data into your data set, Workday runs an integration. And this is basically the ID of that integration run. So if you see, because all of these records have been loaded as part of the same integration, the load ID is same. So this way I know that all of these records were loaded as part of the same integration run. Similarly, if I look at timestamp, the timestamp is also same because all of these records were again loaded as part of the same data load. So Workday automatically creates these two fields, which is WPA fields. Right? So these fields are referred to as WPA fields. And we have WPA underscore load ID. This field defines the unique identifier of the integration run that imported the current row of data into the data set. So when I say current row of data, I'm basically seeing a given row of data. So this ID uniquely identifies how this row of data got imported or as part of which integration run. And similarly, WPA load timestamp, right? This field defines the date and time of the integration run that imported the current row of data into the data set. So we have load ID and load times. Okay. Any questions?
Load ID be same for each row or it's different?
It's same for each row which was loaded as part of a single integration run because all of these rows have been loaded as part of a single run. So
Okay.
as such in replace, every row would have the same load ID because in replace, if you see every time you load a new integration, all the rows gets loaded automatically. So this load ID actually has a significance when you do an append because that way you know every row which has the same load ID, you know it was loaded together as part of a single run. Okay. So every row which was loaded as part of a single run would have the same load ID and the same load timestamp because they are all loaded at the same time. Make sense? So in replace mode, everything would be same because everything gets replaced, right? Everything which was already there gets deleted and your new rows of data gets added. In append mode, you'll see the difference. Make sense?
Yes.
So had this been an append mode and I load data once again, system would add 7 new rows of record and those 7 new rows of record will have a different load ID and the corresponding load timestamp. Okay, but with this, if I reload this data, all of these existing rows will get deleted and new set of rows, 7 rows get added. And all of those 7 rows will again have the same load ID, not this one, the load ID of the new integration run and the new timestamp.
So how will I perform that activity by clicking on refresh? Will it?
No, we'll talk about that. So how
Okay.
we load new set of data, that is something we'll talk about that. Refresh
Okay.
is nothing.
Mhm.
Okay. If you see, the time still doesn't change.
Yes.
Okay. So refresh is only used when your integration is running, right? This is especially, let's say you are loading a million rows of record. In that case, obviously your refresh will take some time to run, right? It will probably take 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So you can keep clicking refresh and it will show you the latest status, similar to how you run your EIBs. Okay. So refresh has no significance here. Okay. Now when I create, so this is my integration mode, replace. This is the description. This is the data source. So this data set has been created using a custom report or a Workday report created on this time, created by this user. Last modified is the same time because I have not changed since then. And then there's no security. The status is not published. Now I can define tags for this data set. So when I create a data set here at this point in time, no tags have been assigned. I can click here and define a new tag. So either I can select an existing tag or I can create a new tag. And I'm creating this tag called Feb7. So whenever I enter some new value, it says, do you want me to create a new tag? I'm saying yes and save. So here I have created a new tag and added the tag to this new data set that I have created. Okay, the next thing. So all clear till now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, the next thing. Now when I click on edit, so this is what you know would take me to the dataset workspace. So when I
Yes.
click on edit, it will take me to the dataset workspace. Now here, if you see, Workday has automatically added a pipeline for me. And that pipeline is a primary pipeline. The name of that pipeline is basically
My BDS name.
name of my dataset. And it
Yeah.
has automatically added a stage called parse stage. So remember this, we'll talk about this later. So the moment I create a dataset, a base dataset, Workday has automatically added a primary pipeline. The name of that primary pipeline is the same as the name of my dataset. And that primary pipeline has a stage, which is basically the parse stage. Okay, I would go back to my data catalog and let's filter on our. So this is my new tag. If I want, I can filter on my tag, and there's just one base data set that I have created till now. Okay, now I want to create new base data sets for my other custom reports. So I'll quickly go and create from custom report. One second. What I'll do is I'll copy the name. Okay, so I want to create a new base data set from a custom report. This time I want to create it from the second report, which is supervisory structure. Now this report has a prompt and I'll have to define the prompt values. So here I'm saying determine value at runtime and this is equal to today. So I want this to take automatically the date on which that data set is being executed. For organizations, I want to select global modern services. Okay, so these are the prompt criteria. Why is it giving me a prompt criteria now? Because this report has a prompt criteria. So
Yep.
obviously I'll have to define the values for those prompt criteria. Okay, again I can specify the restricted to environments. Okay, run now, or I can define a run frequency. We'll talk about this later. For now, I'm just selecting run now. Okay, and here I would give a name to my base data set. So this is my base data set number 02, and this is supervisory details. Again, I want to run this in replace mode, and I'm calling this data set. So this data set imports supervisory structure from Workday. Want to run it in replace mode. Okay. Again, if you see, it is still running, no data yet. So I'm going to refresh it. Right. So this is what refresh is used for. Okay. So now it has imported all the fields, plus it has added the load ID and load timestamp. So if I go in here, the load ID for this one would be different from the load ID for the previous data set. So here the load ID was some E21,
492. Yeah.
and here obviously this is a different integration run. So here the load ID is FE821, either here it is FA821. Okay, and the timestamp is also different. It is 5:15:53, and here it is 16:07. Right, again when I click on edit, it has automatically added a primary pipeline, which is basically the same as the name of my data set, and it has automatically added a stage, which is the parse stage.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to add the same tag here, which is February 7th, and save this. And now if I go back to my data catalog, you see that I have created two base data sets.
Yes.
Okay, finally, I want to create my third base data set. From custom report, ZF, which is worker details. Okay, run now. Oh, replace. I would copy this. I'll call this BDS03, and this is my worker details. Okay, I would go back to my base data set, and there's no data yet because it is still running. Let's refresh, and here I have all the fields, including the load ID, and the load timestamp, which is here.
Yep.
Okay. Again, I want to, because my tag is already created, I'm adding my tag. If I go to edit mode, I have my primary pipeline and a parse stage added. Okay, once we have created our data sets, now if you see, all I have done is I have my data in three different custom reports, and from those three different custom reports, I have brought the data together. I have brought that data into three different base data sets. So at this point in time, if I go back to the data catalog, I have the data which was there in three different custom reports now in three different base data sets. Now, when I did that, Workday created a pipeline for me. So for each of these data sets that I create, Workday has created a pipeline. Okay, so what is a pipeline? We have seen that every data set that we created, Workday added a primary pipeline, and within that
Yes.
primary pipeline, Workday added a stage which was specifically parse stage.
Mhm.
Okay, so what is a pipeline? Your data sets, they contain at least one. So every data set which gets created will have one pipeline automatically added. So data sets may contain one or more pipelines. Each pipeline in turn, so pipelines can contain one or more stages. So data sets contain one or more pipelines. Pipelines can contain one or more stages.
Okay. And
Okay,
the by default stage would be parse or it would be
we'll
different?
talk about that. So I'll talk
Oh,
about what is the parse stage, why it get added, what is the purpose of that parse stage. We'll look at all of those. Okay. For now, every data set will have at least one pipeline, and every pipeline will have at least one stage. Okay. So a pipeline is nothing but a container of stages. So pipeline is nothing but a container of stages. Okay, what does a stage do? What is the purpose of a stage? Stage models the flow of data, or if I can put it the other way, a stage basically transforms the data. So with Prism, I have been talking continuously that Prism is used for your data transformation. So your data preparation, your data blending and cleansing and transformation and modification. So this data transformation and preparation, it happens within a stage. Okay. So each stage performs one action on the data, right? So each stage defines a single transformation action on the data. So your data goes into a stage, if I have to define it the other way. So when you create your base data set, right? Your base data set consists of a pipeline. So this is your pipeline, right? Okay. Now this pipeline consists of a number of stages. So at least you'll in a base data set there will be one pipeline. There could be more, but let's assume for now there is a single pipeline. And this pipeline may have one or multiple stages. So let's assume this is the first stage and this is the second stage and this is my third stage. So this is stage 1, this is stage 2, this is stage 3 and this is stage 4. So these 4 stages together are part of this primary pipeline, which is part of my data set. So what does each stage do? Each stage defines the transformation logic. Now, what is that transformation logic? That is something I'll talk about later. Okay, for now, we need to understand that a base data set contains only one pipeline. So base data set only contains a single pipeline, which is the primary pipeline. So you cannot add more than one pipeline to a base data set. That is why if you see here in this data set, if I click on edit, I don't have the ability to add any new pipeline. There's no option to add a new pipeline. So
Yes.
base data set only has one pipeline, which is referred to as its primary pipeline. Whereas a derived data set, it can contain one, it will always contain one. So the moment you create a derived data set, again, same like a base data set, Workday would automatically add the primary pipeline. So it will always have any data set will always have one pipeline. But then a derived data set, it can have more than one pipelines as well, right? So it will have primary plus additional.
Okay.
Okay. Now the first stage of a pipeline. So for example, in this pipeline that got added, what is the first stage? The first stage, Workday automatically added it. I didn't have to add it. So the first stage of any pipeline, right? So the first stage of any pipeline in any data set, it brings in data from the data source. So if you see, I had a custom report which was my data source. From that custom report, I brought data into this data set. Now, what is this data set? This data set is nothing but a single pipeline which has a single stage. So the first stage, it always brings in data from the data source. So if you see data is flowing from this data source into this primary pipeline. So the first stage is the stage which imports that data. Then the output of the first stage becomes the input of the second stage if it is added. The output of the second stage becomes the input of the third stage. The output of the third stage becomes the input of the fourth stage, and so on and so forth. What if there is only one stage? That stage imports data, and finally that stage exports data. So the output of the final stage is the output of this entire pipeline.
Okay.
Okay, so the first stage in a pipeline, it always brings in data from the data source. Stages listed after the first stage in a pipeline, it take the output of the previous stage, right? Or previous stage of the pipeline, and as the input to the current stage. So any stage which is listed after the first stage in a pipeline, it takes the output of the stage which is previous to it. So the output of this stage becomes the input of this stage. The
Okay.
output of this stage becomes the input of this stage, and so on and so forth. So the input of the current stage is basically the output of the previous stage, right?
Yes,
Okay.
got it.
Then the last stage of any pipeline is the output of the entire pipeline, right? Obviously, that is true. The last stage of this pipeline is the output of this entire pipeline, right?
Yes.
What if there are multiple stages? Sorry, what if there are multiple pipelines? So let's say there is another pipeline, and then there is another pipeline. We already know even when there are multiple pipelines, one pipeline which is the first one which gets created is always the primary pipeline. And then you can have multiple additional pipelines. We'll see that later. So for now, because we are looking at base data set, obviously in a base data set, you cannot have more than one pipeline. So if you see, every pipeline imports some data and exports some data. So this
Yeah.
pipeline is exporting some data, this pipeline is exporting some data, this pipeline is exporting some data. So what is the output of the data set? The output of the, so while the output of the last stage is the output of the entire pipeline, the output of the primary pipeline is the output of the entire data set. So the last stage of any pipeline, or the output of the last stage of any pipeline, is the output of that entire pipeline, and the output of the primary pipeline is the output of this data set. Now, what does it mean? We'll look at that later. So for now, just remember this. Every pipeline imports some data, takes that data through one or multiple sources, and then outputs the transformed data. So the
Both
output
the
of the,
output would be same, right? I mean,
sorry,
both the
here and
output
here.
would be same. No, no. In the BDS, the
Uh-huh.
output of the pipeline as well as the output of the final stage would be same, right?
Yes,
Yep.
exactly. So that's what I'm saying. The
Oh,
output of the primary pipeline is the output of this entire BDS, because
okay.
obviously there's just one pipeline.
Hmm.
Okay, but if there are multiple, if there is a derived data set, each pipeline has an output. The final output of the derived data set is the output of the primary pipeline. Now, this may look confusing, but don't worry. In practice, it's very easy. So when we create actually the derived data set, that's when it will make a lot more sense, right? So pipelines and data sets is a very important concept, because this is where all your transformation is happening, right? So we'll talk about a number of data sets. For now, in this data set, parts is the stage which is automatically added, and we'll talk about this part stage in detail. For now, if you see, I can add additional stages as well. In base data set, only 3 stages can be added. In derived data set, you can add many more stages. So we'll talk about those aspects later.